All right, welcome everybody. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I've got 11 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get this webinar started today. Thanks for joining. My name is JD Tanner. I'm the Director of Education and Training here at Leave No Trace. Very excited to have you all here for our agency partners. This is the second webinar that we've offered to you all this year, and we have two more coming. And to our community partners and members that are joining, welcome to this special opportunity to join this webinar. We're excited to have you on as well. To give you all a little bit of background, in 2023, the organization, we offered our first research grant opportunity. And here it is 2025, and the recipient of that first grant is this group that we have today from North Carolina State University. We are very excited to have them here presenting their findings. So just to give you all a couple of little tips for the session, we definitely encourage questions. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen that you can use to ask those questions. And the team from North Carolina State will provide a little bit of time at the end, and we'll try to get as many of those questions answered as we possibly can. So without any further ado, I'm very excited to introduce to you all Dr. Lincoln Larson, Dr. Yufei Liang, and graduate students Caitlin McDade and Audrey Fatone, all from North Carolina State University. Team, I will let you all take it away.
Thank you. I think I will be the first one to speak. So thank you, Caitlin, for getting the slides ready. Thank you very much for your attendance. And I think we can only see the panelists, but it's okay that I know a lot of you are here to listen and also share your thoughts with our study. So our title is Leave No Trace in the Fun Country, and so we assess the visitor knowledge and behavior through the evaluation of social and ecological indicators. So next slide, Caitlin. And here's our plan to for in the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to look to have a little brief description of the Leave No Trace background and study sites and the intervention we have designed in association with Leave No Trace, and study methods, findings, what we have learned from this, the application of these indicators, and we will have some ideas or suggestions about future research. And then we will have these interactive action questions, Q&A sessions. Next, please. So it's no secret that visitors leave impacts more or less to the natural and even cultural environment, and so we have to really balance the benefits of outdoor recreation and also the negative impacts that perhaps that visitor may leave on the landscape and on the resources. So research has been conducted in the past quite a few decades on recreation ecology and recreation impacts on the environment, but also interventions and methods to reduce those impacts through site design, site management, and also visitor management and visitor education and so forth. And Leave No Trace kind of stands out as one of the pretty long-standing programs focusing on visitor education to reduce the impacts of visitors on the natural landscapes. And the early focus, or I think there's still a strong focus of Leave No Trace, is on the backcountry and the wilderness areas. And then these are just examples that we are showing is the types of impacts that we may find on the natural landscapes because of recreational use. Next, please. And so, and again, since this is a Leave No Trace seminar and webinar, so I think we are more or less familiar with everything here in terms of the 7 principles. And so our study addresses some of these principles or practices as related to the fun country high use recreation sites. So I'll pass this to Lincoln, and then Lincoln will give us a little more background about our study context.
Yeah, thanks for that, Yufei, and yeah, thanks for advancing the slide there, Caitlin. So as Yufei said, historically, as all of you know, Leave No Trace has focused primarily on backcountry settings. And that's really important, especially in wilderness settings and other places like that where we're legislatively mandated to leave no trace. But there's been an impetus lately to push those same principles and practices into front country sites. And that's partly because of the growing demand for front country forms of outdoor recreation, almost unprecedented demand in many places that are creating lots of challenges. And this has been done with mixed results. We've talked a lot about the L&T team, about their work in this space. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's a lot of opportunities here. And what our study was really hoping to do is to figure out ways in which L&T practices, principles and practices can translate to front country settings. So what's unique about these settings? Well, they have a lot more visitors in backcountry settings for sure. Mostly day use visitors, super high density. Go back one more, sorry. Super high density and really high intensity. So here's a picture of a lake in Pennsylvania, I believe. But you can picture front country sites like this. Often beach environments, picnic areas, really popular trailheads, really high levels of use. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, experienced this yourselves. The other thing that makes them different, or one of the other things that makes them different from backcountry settings, is diverse amenities and infrastructure, ranging from parking lots to bathrooms to picnic shelters. There's just a lot more permanent structures, a lot more facilities to maintain, and that also attracts a lot more visitors. So while traditional L&T doesn't perfectly fit this context, there's a lot of overlap and alignment that could be beneficial if the messages are communicated in the right way to the right people. And that gets to the next slide here. Thinking about who those visitors to front country sites are, and are they in some ways different than traditional backcountry users? And the answer is yes, they're very different. They tend to be far more diverse in terms of ages. There's a lot of family groups. The range was, from young kids to much older adults. You don't see that always in the backcountry. You have a lot of first-time recreationists, which is pretty unique to front country sites. And these groups, these settings tend to be far more racially and ethnically diverse than you would see in more backcountry sites. And so here's some pictures from some of our sites, just illustrating some of those points here. This presents unique challenges for managers. If we go to the next one too. Because here, you've got a different set of circumstances you're dealing with. How do you educate visitors who are different than the more traditional backcountry visitor in terms of their outdoor recreation experience, familiarity, maybe their stewardship ethic and everything else? How do you mitigate impacts when recreation is occurring on almost unprecedented scales, talking about millions of annual visits as opposed to a couple thousand in certain trail settings, And then how do you do all that with limited resources? This has always been a challenge. Parks are understaffed, under-resourced. This is even more of a challenge now in the past few months with the current administration and some of the budget cuts and staff reductions that we've seen. So that resource issue is becoming more and more challenging, which means we have to be more efficient with the resources we have, and we have to communicate really effectively to the extent that we can. Next slide, please. We have been thinking about this for some time, even before this grant opportunity from L&T came about. I was working with a grad student at NC State, along with L&T, to develop an implementation guide for front country managers. This guide is in development, nearly able to share widely, but we look at case studies of different sites that have done this well in the front country. We look at communication strategies, some of the challenges and barriers that sites have encountered and how they might be navigated. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this guide today. Bon was at the L&T Summit and presented a little bit about it there. But if anybody's interested in this guide and learning more about how to use it, just let me know. My emails will be at the end of the slides here, and you can let me know. So moving away from front country in general to our specific recreation sites, this is where our work was conducted in Western North Carolina. You can see the map there just west of Asheville, really in the Brevard area. The two sites we chose were Hooker Falls and Rainbow Falls. Hooker Falls is managed by the North Carolina Forest Service. It's a state recreational forest. It's in DuPont State Recreational Forest specifically, famous for Hunger Games filming. It's for one of the sites where that was filmed, but super popular, one of the most popular park destinations in all of North Carolina, with over a million visitors a year to this area. The waterfall itself is just about a quarter mile from a big parking lot very accessible, great swimming hole, really cool, cool access for a lot of people who might not be able to experience other types of waterfall settings. Rainbow Falls is at Gorges State Park. Actually, it's in Pisgah National Forest, but you access it through Gorges State Park. And so the Forest Service is a partner on this as well. And this is a really beautiful state park. This site is a little harder to get to. It's still a relatively short walk, a couple miles to get to the waterfall itself, but it's very much a day use site that is popular among a lot of people in Western North Carolina. So they're not perfectly comparable sites, but we did the best we could in picking waterfall sites that are accessible to, hundreds of day users every day. Rainbow Falls was actually our control site, so we did not implement any intervention there, although all the monitoring occurred at Rainbow Falls throughout our study period, as Audrey's going to explain shortly. Hooker Falls is where we actually implemented the intervention itself, and I'll tell you more about what that looked like now. The focus on this project was messaging, and our original intent was to attempt messaging in various forms, including more traditional signs, all the way to social media and more, contemporary methods, you could say, of reaching different audiences. Due to a variety of reasons, one of which was capacity and ability of our partners to engage in a social media campaign, we were forced to resort to traditional signage only when we implemented our message testing, which we'll talk more about the limitations and opportunities associated with that later. But this is what our signs look like in the treatment site, which was Hooker Falls, DuPont State Recreational Forest. There's the trailhead here. As you can see, we put a sign right there, and we put the exact same sign at the base of the falls. I'll zoom in on the sign here in a second. We also posted similar signs in water fountains and bathroom stalls and other places where visitors at the park are likely to congregate. Next slide. This is what the sign looked like. 2 languages. We chose English and Spanish based on what managers told us about their typical clientele at the park, at the forest, I should say. There were it's more diverse than that. There's a lot of languages spoken there, but these were the 2 primary ones, which is why we chose Spanish. You'll also notice a few other things on these signs that I want to point out. We do not highlight 7 principles. We only highlight 4 that are most relevant to front country settings. And we spent a lot of time working with JT, with Bryce and others at L&T, Derek Taft too, to figure out what those 4 should be, and with input from managers too. And this is what we settled on. Other elements of sign design that we incorporated with the hope of making this more eye-catching and appealing to visitors. We included a map. Most people are more likely to look at signs that include a map of some kind. So we added that in the top, as you can see. We also included the American flag in the bottom right. There's some research done to suggest that many people are more likely to respond to signs, particularly signs involved about protecting a resource, if it evokes kind of patriotic motives in some way. And that's a very bipartisan approach too. So these are just little elements of the sign, or little aspects that we spent a lot of time thinking about and working on to create. The last thing I'll mention is too, you see it's not just words. There's a note about accessibility with the icons. So if you aren't able to read either of these languages or just struggle reading in general, there are icons there to make this universally accessible and hopefully understandable to people who can't quite follow along with the words for some reason. And so this is something we've been working on with L&T, and I know Will Rice at Montana and others have been working on this to figure out the best ways to visually and graphically communicate the same themes without, very wordy, verbose text. So that was the intervention. Our specific study objectives, I'll highlight them now, and then I'll pass it on to Audrey here. We wanted to understand front country visitors self-reported and assessed and observed L&T related knowledge and behaviors in general. And then the second piece of that is we actually wanted to investigate the effect of this messaging campaign, which was really just the signs I showed you, on those self-reported and assess and observe knowledge and behaviors. Then the third piece that we address is evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of different types of indicators. So not just the social self-reported survey indicators, but also some ecological indicators that Audrey will talk about and Caitlin will describe, and look at how they could be coupled or integrated to help managers hoping to evaluate the impacts of an L&T initiative like this one. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Audrey to talk more about our methods in detail. And I'll also just note that I've got to go teach a class on, of all topics, outdoor recreation management in a few minutes, so I might have to drop off early. But if anybody wants to follow up with me later, please do. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lincoln. So, as we mentioned a bit, just now, we studied both the social and the ecological indicators in our methodology, which is pretty unique to our study that we captured both at the same locations. And we did 2 separate series of data collection. We collected data pre-intervention, so before we put up the signs at Hooker Falls, we took base data collection, including the surveys, observations of people, and all of the physical measurements before the signs. And then we returned after the signs had been up for a few months at the end of the summer and readdressed and redid all of our methods for the second time. So Caitlin and I were out there for a total of about 4 weeks throughout the season and had a lot of fun, and we got a lot of good work done. So now I'm just going to go into each and one of these methodologies and how we captured each of the variables that we have listed below here. And later on, Caitlin's going to address kind of the effectiveness of using these indicators to answer our questions. So yeah, so here, the first thing we did on that list is surveys. So intercept surveys was a huge part of our study. This was Caitlin and I standing at trailheads throughout the entire weekend days with a hard copy survey, coming up to pretty much every group of folks that we saw and asked them if they were interested in filling out our survey. It's important to note that although we did collect surveys at the beginning, pre-intervention and post-intervention, there's no way of actually collecting data from the same folks that we met at the early part of the season. So even though it is a pre-post study, we did not reach back out to the same respondents for the second part. So it's not perfect, but we were able to get a lot of surveys and we met a lot of really awesome people out there. And if anyone's interested in looking deeper into what specific questions we asked and just looking closer at our survey itself, let us know, and we're more than happy to email this to you after our presentation. So we collected surveys that had information about people's understanding of Leave No Trace, and as well as their reported behaviors while they're out there. But we wanted to kind of check that. And so we also did actual observations. So we would go to the waterfall multiple times a day, record where people are sitting, if they're on rocks or dangerous non-Leave No Trace locations. We reported that. If dogs are off leash, we reported that. And also just the general number of people that are everywhere. So we did that at the waterfall site, and then we also did that along the trail and saw if folks were hiking on trail. And we always took note of the number of people we saw and the percentage of people that were on social trails or not hiking on trail, which would be something that would be against Leave No Trace in our study. So yeah. And then, so the observations, the physical observations, we were only able to do during the weeks that we were there. So another thing that we did to keep track of what are people's behavior in regard to Leave No Trace and traveling on durable surfaces, responsible behavior, is that we had trail cameras set up at both of our sites. We had 2 trail cameras set up at each site. One was a motion activated one that kind of captured people on social trails. So we can see this kind of Bigfoot-esque picture here on the left. It was motion activated and took photos if it indicated that people were walking. And this is an example above Hooker Falls of a closed section of trail that is now social trail that people illegally take to go stand on top of the waterfall, which is very dangerous. So we were able to capture that. And then we also had a camera that was just taking a snapshot every what was it, Caitlin, every like half hour?
Yeah, it took one every half hour between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. if I recall correctly.
Yeah, so those pictures were able to kind of just capture how many people are at the waterfall at a given time, and usually we could kind of tell if folks were off of the rocks or doing something illegal or considered non-Leave No Trace in that photograph. And shout out to Caitlin for going through all of those pictures and analyzing them, because that was a lot of work. So yeah, we put these up as soon as we got there at the beginning of the season, and then we took them down after we were done all of our surveying in September. So we had a lot of data for Caitlin to go through.
43,000+ photos.
Okay, next slide. So not only did we capture social trails, just seeing people walking them, we also just kind of counted how many there were and we rated them as we walked. So I'll talk a little bit about the rating system and following slides, but essentially we just walked all the trails and used a GPS device and recorded and took note of all the locations of social trails along the main route. And so it's not a perfect map here, just because this is a short trail and to get super accurate with the GPS device is difficult, but I do think this captures a pretty good idea, that showing that people are going off trail, and it tends to congregate around the waterfall site. And we did this as like everything, we did it before and after. And then we also measured the actual trail measurements. We did this for social trails and along the actual trail. So we did this intermittently every few 100 feet on the main trail, and that included looking at the trail width and incision, the composition, so the percent cover of litter versus rocks versus soil, and the aspect and grade, which included how steep the actual trail is relatively to the steepest area around. So that might be across the trail, or it also might be the trail itself, if that's the steepest part of the landscape there. And we compare these pre-intervention and post-intervention as well. Yeah. And then social trail conditions, like I said, we captured where they were, we measured them, and then we also put them into different classes of how bad they were, how used they were, how established they were. And that came from anything from social trails like the one on the left, class 1, which is kind of the start of a trail where you can barely make it out, where people are walking among the vegetation, and then all the way class 5, which is you cannot differentiate it from the actual trail itself. It's super eroded, exposed roots, extremely compact soil, basically no litter or vegetation growing on it at all. And yeah, we encountered both of these. And then the final physical measurement that we did on our just something that we found would be interesting to capture is, you know, a lot of waste accumulates at front country sites. A lot of people are eating food there. A lot of people are drinking both non-alcoholic and alcoholic beverages. And so what we did is, before every morning where we surveyed, we walked the trails and we picked up all of the trash that we saw along the trail and the social trails and at the waterfall itself. So that included, we found a lot of really interesting things along the way. The craziest thing was this AC/DC inner tube. We actually found 2 of those that were left at the waterfall site from the day before. This included human waste and dog waste as well. So all of that was encountered in our weight. We didn't dry anything out, so they included all of, like, the water weight and stuff that might have been in our measurements. But yeah, so we did that before every survey session at both of our sites, and that was pretty gross, but it also felt that we were out there, like, helping with something too. Stewardship and stuff like that is really important to me. So it was gross, but it also felt kind of rewarding. Cool. And now Caitlin's going to talk about what we found through all of the many data measurements we took.
Yeah, thank you, Audrey. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of an overview and some key points to highlight, and then we'll kind of tackle it somewhat in order of the objectives that we listed out earlier. And so one of the first things, kind of touching back to the first points that Lincoln was making about front country sites, drawing much more diverse visitors. Almost 1 in 5 visitors came with kids, and 1 in 5 are coming with dogs. And this is pretty different than what someone might see in the backcountry. Like Audrey's planning to hike the AT this year, and I don't think she'll see too many kids or dogs on that trip, not near as many as we saw at our sites. And another thing to note right here, this is a bullet point I want you to just keep in mind as we go through the next couple results, is that we are asking many individuals who might be their first time to one of these sites on a first hike or just accompanying a friend who normally hikes. They're not necessarily familiar with Leave No Trace. So in our survey that we briefly showed you earlier and we can send out, we asked people, did they see our LNT signs, our Leave No Trace signs? And a lot of people said yes. And this was regardless of if it was at the control site or the treatment site or before or after our signs went up, pre-post intervention. And this is important only because it told us that whenever we were going in to analyze our later results, which we did using some linear regression, we didn't want to just look at pre and post intervention because clearly, some of the visitors weren't really distinguishing between any signs that they saw. A lot of front country sites already have signs posted, and we couldn't remove those. So they can't really distinguish between those signs and the Leave No Trace signs. So this just informed how we later conducted our analysis. So whenever we ran linear regressions, we ran 2 models, one where we looked at findings based off of pre-post intervention, and one where we looked at if visitors said that they saw a sign. So we kind of treated that as one of our independent variables, what we weren't necessarily expecting, but our preliminary data indicated we should look at. And then another bullet point just to note, and this is just kind of important, going back to what Lincoln talked about with the messaging, what we were looking to do at the beginning with social media and putting signs up. We also asked visitors where they thought messaging would be most effective, and signs on the trail was the overwhelming response, with 85% of visitors selecting that. The 2 follow-ups for that were going to be signs elsewhere on site, which we also had, and then through conversations with staff, which, as we know, can be a lot harder whenever managers and these sites have limited resources and time. But moving from there, we're going to start going through the findings we have from our first objectives. And that was, again, to assess visitors' LNT-related knowledge and behaviors, and then also to look at how that LNT messaging might have influenced that, looking, again, pre and post intervention. So to do this, we created 4 key dependent variables, and those are listed out here. So self-reported knowledge, we simply asked visitors to describe their current level of LNT on a scale of 1 to 7. But we wanted to compare this to what they actually knew. And so we kind of assessed this by creating a little quiz, which is right here. We listed out 15 behaviors, a mix of good and bad, and we asked them, is this an LNT behavior? So then we just graded it on whether or not they correctly identified if this was or was not an LNT behavior, and they got the grade. And that was our assessed LNT knowledge variable. And then similarly, we were interested in how often people thought they were doing these behaviors. So right here, they have a scale from never, 1 to 5, always, where we asked how often they do these good and bad behaviors. And so from that, going through point by point, we're going to start with self-reported LNT knowledge. What we found is that 68% of visitors reported, and again, self-reported, that they think they have an above average knowledge on LNT. So again, that was on that 1 through 7 scale. So that was about a 4.91 was the mean score. And from our linear regressions, what we found is that compared to their other demographic groups, self-reported LNT knowledge was highest amongst visitors who are white, older, liberal, had dogs, or who participated often in outdoor recreation. And so we're going to keep going through each of these, but I want you to pay attention to some of these bullet points, because each of these bullet points kind of offer some insight into maybe where we should look. So if people who participate often in outdoor recreation really do have higher LNT knowledge, then maybe we need to try to target those who are first-time visitors. So thinking about that when we're creating signs. But of course, this is only self-reported LNT knowledge. So it's really important to first make sure we're also getting assessed knowledge, which we'll look at in a minute, and then look at, do these signs change anything? Because that's the whole goal. Will our messaging increase what people are learning and looking at? And we did note that at least amongst self-reported LNT knowledge, if visitors said that they saw a sign, their confidence did increase whenever they were reporting their leave no trace knowledge. So that jumped from a 4.45 to a 4.92. And so moving to assessed LNT knowledge, overall, a lot of people scored pretty well on our LNT quiz, about an 82 on average. But again, comparing demographic groups, what we saw is that LNT knowledge was highest amongst visitors who are white, younger, or first-time visitors. And so this part right here, if you remember from self-reported, is actually a little contradictory. And it might indicate then that people who recreate often don't know as much as they think they know, which again is just pretty important to think about whenever you're researching or whenever you're thinking about who do you want to appeal to at sites. People who are there often probably do think they know how to behave. So how do you change those behaviors that they're used to and cemented in? And assessed LNT knowledge we didn't see any change between sites, intervention, or if they saw the sign. So all of those independent variables that we were checking for with our linear regressions, we didn't see any significant changes, which again, we'll get to later, shows that maybe more research needs to be done on how to attract attention to these signs. And so the next two dependent variables that we said we were going to talk about are those good and bad LNT behaviors that we had. So here you can see those 15 behaviors that we have grouped out, and the mean frequency in which people reported those. We, of course, always hope that they aren't doing the bad behaviors, but we can see that some of these are more frequent than others. And so the most frequent good behavior was staying on trail, but the least common was separating recyclables. Whereas for bad behaviors, even though people say that they stayed on trails, moving to avoid muddy and wet spots was the most common bad behavior. On a plus side, carving into trees was least common. So especially since we were at a forestry site, that was somewhat nice to see. And again, looking to our linear regressions from what we found, overall, almost 3/4 of visitors reported engaging in LNT aligned behaviors often or very often. Again, that was on that 5-point scale. And for sociodemographic correlates, more frequent good behaviors were reported by visitors who are white and older. And again, self-reported. But we also saw that less frequent was by males and those with graduate degrees. And at the treatment site, those who saw signs again, so seeing signs seemed to be this kind of important difference more so than the intervention. But if visitors saw signs at Hooker Falls, where we actually had the treatment, they were more likely to report good behaviors than those who didn't. In terms of bad behaviors, we were really happy to see that very, very few visitors, less than 5%, reported engaging in bad behaviors often or very often. You saw in that longer list, a lot of those were down in the 1 range on our scale of 1 to 5 for how frequent do you participate in this. And the only sociodemographic correlate that we found from that was that those who tend to participate in bad behaviors a little bit more frequently are those visitors who are younger. And again, we only surveyed those who were 18. We didn't really want to deal with IRB and trying to get surveys from kids who were at our site. So the youngest age that we had was 18-year-olds, and the oldest age that we had at our sites from surveys was 90. And again, we didn't actually see a change in reported behaviors between our intervention or between site locations, or if they reported seeing a sign or not. And so with that, that's all, as I've kind of emphasized, self-reported behaviors. And as Audrey said, she went through a lot of methods. We did a lot of stuff because we cared about both social and ecological indicators, but also we don't just want to rely on what are people saying they do. We want to know what are people actually doing. And so for that, we conducted, if you recall, some direct observations, as well as some observations kind of throughout the summer, indirectly through our trail cameras. And our direct observations didn't reveal a lot. Part of that is likely because While we were out there, we spent a lot of our time taking surveys, a couple days collecting biophysical measurements. So there were very limited data points that we had for direct observations. But our trail cameras that we had up throughout the summer did reveal significant decreases in the use of the social trails that we were monitoring. So we do have two axes here. So just making sure you're looking at this clearly. Our treatment site, Hooker Falls, saw fewer visitors per week on its social trails than Rainbow Falls did. And so two axes there. But regardless, the difference here is significant for Hooker Falls, whereas at our control site, kind of as expected, there's no difference. So this is very interesting only because intervention-wise with our linear regressions, we didn't see too much change in those 4 dependent variables that we just went through, but actual observable changes in terms of number of people on a social trail was a very clear drop between pre and post intervention when we put those signs up, which was really exciting to see. And so it kind of begs the question, how much is our sign actually doing? And so I want you to think for a minute, feel free to shout out or put it in the chat even. What % of visitors stopped to look at our signs? What do you think? Because we figured this might be a useful question to ask and kind of collect some data on in terms of evaluating the rest of our responses. So in our post-intervention, we also did 30-minute intervals where we clicked and we were like, okay, how many people are actually stopping? All right, so one person's got 10%, 20%, anyone higher or lower, 20, 40, 10? Yeah, the 10s are closest. We had 13.1% of our visitors that walked by our sign at the trailhead actually stop and look at it, which is pretty low. It's kind of expected, as you can see from the responses we got. But we also made one other note, and that was who is stopping at our signs. So just a very quick tally. We were handing out surveys at the same time. There were 2 of us though, so one of us took on the job of looking at visitors. And we also noted who was an adult and who was a child who stopped at our sign. And what was really interesting with this is that over a third of the visitors who stopped, over a third of this 13%, were children. And I just think that that's very interesting in terms of looking to the future. And again, talking about who should the signs be targeting. It's a little bit revealing that kids stop. And sometimes whenever the kids stop too, we notice that that caused the parents to stop. We didn't really have anything other than like a small little jotted note about that, just because that was kind of the sideline. But I'm happy to discuss this more. I really like environmental education. If y'all have any questions about that at the end or just points to talk about, we can come back to this. But moving to our third objective and the findings from that is focusing on, we collected a lot of data. So far, we've pretty much focused on what did people report? How did our intervention impact that? What were the observable changes? But we also had a lot of ecological indicators. And the thing is we only had those points from the beginning of summer and the end of summer. And while we tried to set up some trail counters, and one site already had a trail counter so that we could maybe make more sense of this data, because you do want to account for the number of visitors who are on each trail. We had some problems with that. And so what we're doing with this is just kind of trying to identify some strengths and weaknesses with the indicators. And that's the last bit that we're going to go through before we wrap up for some questions. So we're just going to go line by line, but these are all of our indicators, and we're just going to go through some of the strengths and weaknesses. And this is kind of one of the bigger takeaways for any site managers and staff that might be present. Kind of evaluating your site, looking at areas that need help, understanding why visitors are doing what we're doing. If I switch back for a second, if you think about the difference between these two indicators, research often focuses on one, as Audrey said earlier. And the social indicators kind of ask the question of why are visitors doing what they're doing, or how often do they think, do they report what they're doing? And ecological indicators kind of show what's happening because of that, how much degradation is happening. So you've kind of got the why and then the what and how with these two different indicators. But they're inherently intertwined. And so thinking from a managerial perspective about how you can use this and study this, we wanted to evaluate a lot of indicators and kind of highlight strengths and weaknesses that managers and sites can contemplate whenever thinking about how to evaluate their site, potentially for what interventions they should be implementing, where should they be implementing those interventions, or even kind of as we did in this case, if you put up an intervention, how can you collect data before you do that and after to actually see if your intervention is causing change. So these pair with everything that we did. Social trail mapping. At one of our sites, we had rangers who walked the trails on a fairly regular basis. And so if you have access to a GPS, it's fairly easy to just ask your site member who's walking that trail to, as they're walking, go ahead and gauge where social trails are. They can just pin a point. It doesn't take much extra time at all. And so it's relatively quick, and it's fairly easy to then upload that data to various programs. However, the downside of that is it does require people to know what is a social trail. Some sites have water runoff trails. That's a little bit, water runoff is different than whenever you have a social trail. So we went through, we did site visitations, and we kind of went over this to make sure, since Audrey and I were both gauging these, that we were on the same page. And it does require the time to do that and awareness that there might be some subjectivity there. As well as Audrey mentioned, on shorter trails or with a less precise GPS, it can be kind of hard to pair these GPS points over time. Trail measurements is something else that we did. These can be done on formal or social trails. And this is really great for seeing degradation. One of the easiest measurements, I think, for looking at that that we collected was like trail incision. So are people kind of always walking around this muddy part? Are they going through it? And so that can be really easy to just kind of visualize through numbers how visitors are impacting a site. But the trail measurements are very time consuming. Audrey and I think, spent between 1 and 2 days at each site just collecting about 14 measurements throughout the trail system. And so again, you also then, whenever you're doing these, if you're doing it over time, need to make sure that you are finding the exact right spot so that your measurements come from the same place. And there is always going to be some amount of expected degradation at a site. So if you're thinking about summer months like we were, at the beginning of summer, it's going to be right after winter. The trails probably had less use. And over summer, you're going to have that increased use. So thinking about, can you account for that by using trail counters or something else? Trail conditions are somewhat similar in, I'm going to start with their weaknesses because they are subjective. So if you think back to those pictures that we had, it can sometimes be hard whenever you're just putting it on a scale of 1 to 5 to distinguish between what's a 1 and a 2. If I see just the start of a route, do I count that as route exposure? Do I bump that up to a class 4? And so that's also difficult. And then with that as well, if you're describing class 1 as there's a lot of vegetation, it's not all that easy to find the trail. In the winter, it might be much more obvious because of vegetation loss. And so on the other side, though, this can be a really quick assessment. If you've got somebody, again, kind of like social trail mapping, who's walking the trails, we did these two at the same time. You can GPS mark the social trail and then very quickly kind of look at the trail and decide, is it not at all eroded, 1, or is it a hot mess? You can see bedrock trail, everything's trampled, class 5. Trash weight is probably the thing that we had the biggest trouble with. It's very obvious that it's a great way to link visitors and their improper behaviors. And a lot of sites send people out to already collect trash. If you're doing that regularly, it's not that difficult to throw it on a scale. But we happened to go out on Labor Day weekend for our second round of data collection in hopes of getting a lot of surveys. And whenever you have a normal weekend in May for your first data point, and then Labor Day weekend, you have to realize that you're not going to be able to tell a great story with those few data points. So it's time consuming, and then you just need to be very careful of when you're doing it and when you're comparing those weights. With surveys, we've kind of gone through a good bit of this. They're very helpful for understanding what visitors are thinking and what they want. But as I emphasized, it's self-reported data. You're only getting data from those who agree to take your surveys. And as we know, there's implicit survey biases where visitors might change their responses a little bit to what they think you want to hear. So I won't spend too much more time on that. The last two that we're going to talk about are kind of the direct and indirect observations that we did. Conducting observations are great ways to very quickly understand what visitors are doing. And again, what they're actually doing, not just what they report from those surveys. However, this is much, much more time consuming. And furthermore, it doesn't give insight into the drivers of behavior, and it doesn't give you a great idea of, okay, well, is the activity just that one day? If they're off on a social trail, is it a new social trail? Do you really need to worry about that social trail? And that's where, again, looking at pairing these observations with an ecological indicator can give you a more comprehensive idea. So those are for direct observations. Indirect observations aren't as time consuming in terms of making the observations. As Audrey said, we used cameras. They were either motion triggered or on a timer, and it provides very consistent, authentic observations. You can put them in locations where it's a little bit more difficult for visitors to tell that they're being observed. So you also don't have to worry about if they're changing their behaviors, which is a possibility with direct observations. For reference, Audrey and I just kind of did this very quickly as we were walking the trail. Visitors didn't really have time to change their behaviors. And furthermore, I don't think anybody that I can recall changed any behaviors based off of seeing us. We tended to just use a little clicker to discreetly mark things. But back to the trail cameras with the weaknesses with those. As I have found, we ended up collecting 43,500 photos. And the analysis of this can be very, very time consuming. I do still think it's really important to note though, because this is a great way for consistent observations. And in other research areas, we're starting to see AI being used to evaluate these camera images. So Audrey mentioned that we had these on our trail cameras, or I'm sorry, on our social trails and over the waterfall sites. And another thing that we learned is that the location of the camera can be very important. You tend to want it to be more hidden. We had one camera get stolen this summer. We went out frequently to change the SD cards and batteries anyway, and we had a backup, so we were able to continue data collection. But that is a risk. And also the camera that was above our waterfalls, when sun hits water throughout a fair portion of the day, it can cause a very harsh glare that makes the images pretty difficult to pinpoint where people are, if they're in areas where they should be or shouldn't be. So that wasn't an issue for our social trails, but thinking about what sites you're working at, and again, what's going to work for what you're evaluating is really important. So that wraps up a lot of what we collected. I'm going to try to hurry here. I touched a bit throughout on kind of where research should head, so I'm just going to kind of run through this. But L&T should continue collecting research across diverse contexts, especially in the front country. It can have a much wider reach here. And furthermore, social and ecological indicators can tell a much more comprehensive story. And that's a great area for future research. A lot of research currently focuses on either social or ecological indicators, or lists them all out as like a choose one when they can be paired together. And also the signs are something that we've talked about a lot. The number of visitors that we saw on our social trail decreased a lot at our treatment site. So it's possible that the signs worked, but more research needs to be done to evaluate exactly what signs grab attention and how well we can actually link these two. There's a lot of other factors. We can't directly attribute it to our sign, especially whenever only 13% of people that we saw post-survey data collection or post-intervention data collection stopped at the sign. And then again, are certain demographic groups should you be aiming to grab their attention? Do you need to appeal to other visitors more, such as those who are frequent visitors who think they know a lot and report that, but don't reveal that whenever they're assessed? And again, we only use signs, so what other message media might be effective? And implications for practice, that's what we highlighted a lot. That was kind of the goal of Objective 3, but recognizing that front country sites face unique challenges because of the diverse visitors and the multitude of visitors that they attract. And so it can be really important, especially when you're working with something like Leave No Trace, to highlight the key principles that matter and the behaviors that you want to change. So for example, from our research, avoiding muddy puddles might be something that people want to focus on instead of minimizing campfire impacts. And so again, don't just rely on conventional signs to communicate with visitors. Our research has shown that not too many visitors stop to look at our signs, so future research might want to continue investigating that, as we've said, but site managers might want to be open to looking at other methods for that. Even if it is a little more time consuming, it might pay off in the long run. And again, those social ecological indicators, it's pretty interesting to think about how you can use both of those to address both why people are doing things and the impacts those will have. So we're pretty much at the end here, but before we really open up for questions, I just want to shout out a huge thanks to all of our project partners. Leave No Trace was wonderful to work with, and I especially want to shout out Derek, Taff, Bryce Esplin, and JT Tanner. They were a huge help in helping us design the survey and make these signs. And then, of course, the sites that we were at, so our North Carolina Forest Service and the state parks. And right before we get to questions, I just want to shout out a huge public service announcement. If you are hiring, Audrey Fatone, our graduate student, is wrapping up. She will be defending on May 7th. And after she hikes the AT, she would really love to work for anyone who is interested in coming to a presentation like this. So we appreciate you being here. And with that, if you have any questions, we would love to answer them.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin, Audrey, Yufei, and Lincoln. We appreciate all of your hard work on this project. For all of the participants here, please use that Q&A function at the bottom. And I'm going to turn it over to Sam, and he's going to check that and answer any questions that you all might have.
Yeah, so just a technical note here. As a default, you do not have speaking permissions, but if you would like to speak your own question, you can just put that into the Q&A. And we do have the chat function open as well, and I'm monitoring both of those. I've got a question here from Leave No Trace staff. Despite focusing on popular sites in North Carolina, I'm curious what kind of applied findings you have that might translate to practice in other similar locations, maybe with different land management.
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the benefits of this is we focused on kind of waterfall sites as the front country location, which allowed us to work within a state park that actually crossed into a national forest, Pisgah, as well as DuPont State Recreational Forest. So we've got some forestry lands, parks, and what we saw across both of those sites were diverse visitors that differ from our kind of own personal experience and what the research shows is present at those backcountry sites. So I think too, we were already thinking, you're going to have more family gatherings, friends gatherings. We saw quite a few bachelor and bachelorette party groups as well. But whenever you're focusing again on that sign detail that we saw, kids, I think, are one of those visitors that are going to be common to sites across the state, across the country. Families go out, they're looking to spend time together. Kind of saw that boom during COVID, I think highlighted that as well. And I think thinking about how you can appeal to those visitors is really important. The other thing is we worked with LNT. Sites are different place to place. A waterfall site might be much more concerned about keeping visitors off a social trail that leads to the top of the waterfall than a site without a waterfall. So making sure you pay attention to what your site is interested in, I think was really important for what signs you're putting up.
I can
Thank
maybe
you.
add one like minor point out of your question that I think the reported knowledge we reported we find some discrepancy between reported knowledge and assessed knowledge. I think that is important, has some important implications to managers about how can we address the groups that who they think they know better, but they actually not in terms of the actual knowledge or maybe even behavior. So how can we address this and maybe change some of these maybe wisdom or some kind of ideas that I think we had that before with leaf load trace, like orange peels are like can be is degradable. So how can we change behavior that they might be actually ingrained in the kind of traditional knowledge, and then might science might help in maybe addressing this and showing that perhaps there are we need to kind of change some of the behavior because of what we know more about that particular impact.
Thank you both for your insight. We've got a question from Dave Mercia who asks, you identified survey participants as liberal. How and why did you identify them as such?
I can answer that, Caitlin, if you want. The political identity question was just a simple question on the survey itself. It was the last question that we asked. Because I think if we put that at the beginning, then people may not want to fill out the rest of the survey. But it was just like, where do you identify along the political spectrum, anywhere from very liberal through moderate to very conservative. And we just kind of wanted to capture more information just about like who is visiting these sites and who's answering our questions. And then the people who identified as like liberal, I guess, were more likely to report leave no trace, like self-reported knowledge. So that's pretty much it. But I think, Caitlin, would you get majority of people visiting our sites were conservative, would you say? Or
Give
was
me a
it pretty
minute and I'll
even?
look that up. I was gonna say, because I know I have the demographics somewhere. I can't remember. We had moderates as an answer too, which skewed things. I think moderates might have actually been the majority. When we ran analyses though, because of that, it doesn't really make sense to compare moderates in the next or group conservatives and liberals. So we actually kind of just looked at conservatives and liberals for that analysis. And I've got the question and answer pulled up. So I see Steve and Celeste, y'all's questions. Steve asked, what impact did contacting the visitors have on practices of visitors? Did having a presence improve adopting principles? And Audrey, feel free to chime in on this. But I'll start by saying we were doing exit surveys. So we waited until they came back out. And if anybody stopped, we were like, we're surveying, we'll get you at the end. If they stopped before they had gone through the trail. So it didn't really have an impact on their visit and anything they did on their hike. However, one thing that was really kind of fun to watch was a lot of people would get ready and they'd be like on our test question, especially, and they'd be like, oh, I know, leave no trace. This is great. I'm so excited for this. Or someone would be like, you know, I thought I was doing great, but I feel like I should go and change my knowledge of leave no trace question now because I'm reading these behaviors and I kind of always thought leave no trace was just pick up my trash. So I do think after they took their hike, it influenced some people to be a little bit more aware of there's a lot more stuff going on. And some people would even ask like, hey, can you tell me what I got right and wrong? And so once they finished the survey, we would go through that with them. And some people were curious about things like, if I'm leaving biodegradable trash, like what's my banana peel doing? And so then it was really nice because we would be able to talk to visitors about, well, you're habituating animals. That's not always great.
I also think we were pretty intentional about saying who we were and what we were doing there. Like we were not there, even though we both have a history of environmental educators, we were like very clear to say like, oh, we're here as like student researchers and we just want to know more about your visit and your perspectives on things. And it was a totally like neutral way to approach folks instead of like coming at it from an angle of like, well, we're promoting leave no trace and we want all this. Like we're really happy to provide those educational moments, but like after the survey was done and hopefully and when other folks weren't around that were taking the survey as well. So yeah.
All righty. Well, we're just about at time. I'm wondering if Caitlin or anybody else wants to answer Dave's follow-up question about conducting follow-up surveying or at other high-use areas like national parks.
I know Audrey and I are both graduating soon. I am headed to a PhD program where my research will be shifting a little bit more so that it's a little bit more environmental education focused. However, I personally would love to see more of these studies done. I know Leave No Trace is very open to it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But other than that, I don't know too much. I know that our advisors, Yufei and Lincoln, have been involved in Leave No Trace for a while. So I'm sure
Uh,
there will be some.
Yeah, just
Okay.
really quickly. Yeah, we definitely have interest in doing more on high use sites in major national parks or national parks in different places and even beyond the U.S. But I think we don't have any concrete plan of doing it like at this moment. We don't have any direct projects ongoing, but we have strong interest in continuing and expanding this type of work.
And I see there's more questions in the chat. If we don't have time to answer them, but you are more than welcome to email any of us and we'd love to get back to you and continue this conversation.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, yeah.
Zoe, I saw. Oh, sorry.
No, you're okay, Caitlin. I was going to say they've got their emails up there. I'd encourage you all to reach out directly to them if you have more questions. And then I'll also mention to the folks that are still on the call, if you're interested in working with Dr. Leong or Dr. Larson on a project in your park, I'm sure they would be interested in hearing from you. And then the Leave No Trace grant comes out right around September every year that we ask for requests for that specific grant. So I would encourage you all to do that if you're interested in continuing some work with Dr. Leong or Dr. Larson. So I think with that all said, we're past 12 by just a little bit. So we want to respect everybody's time and encourage you all again to reach out directly to any of the NC State team if you have more questions. But appreciate you all coming on board and spending some time with us. And again, thanks to the NC State team for all of your great work.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
everyone
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't forget, Audrey is looking for a job. She's great.
Alrighty. Well, the recording of this will be available for folks. If you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to them or reach out to us at Leave No Trace. And yeah, I think that's that. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Bye, everyone.